In the late 1980s, deep inside Motorola's semiconductor labs, engineers built something they truly believed could be the future. It was fast, it was clean, it embodied the hottest ideas in computer architecture at the time. On paper, the Motorola 8800 RISC processor family could stand proudly next to anything from MIPS, SPARC, or even the designs brewing inside IBM. Engineers who worked with it often described the 88K as elegant. It had a streamlined instruction set, a forward-looking memory system, and big ambitions for scalability. This wasn't some half-hearted side project. It was meant to carry Motorola and its customers into the next era of high-performance computing. And yet, today, the 8800 is mostly a historical footnote. You don't see it in the great CPU family trees next to x86, ARM, or even PowerPC. Its name surfaces mainly in retro computing forums, CPU enthusiast blogs, and the occasional museum display. So what happened? How did a processor with real engineering merit, built by a company riding high on the success of the legendary 6800, end up commercially doomed and largely forgotten? In this video, we're going to trace the rise and fall of the Motorola 8800, how it came to be, who adopted it, why Motorola turned away from it, and what traces of it you can still find today. And along the way, we'll look at a bigger question that still matters. In the chip world, when technical quality isn't enough, what actually decides which architectures live and which quietly disappear? To understand the 8800, we have to rewind to the mid-1980s. Motorola was in a strong position. Its 6800 family, the 68K line, powered early Apple Macs, the Commodore Amiga, Atari ST systems, high-end workstations, even arcade boards. It was a classic SIS design, a rich instruction set, powerful addressing modes, and a reputation for being pleasant to program for. But around it, the ground was starting to shift. In universities, particularly at Berkeley and Stanford, researchers were pushing a different idea: reduced instruction set computing, RISC. Instead of a big, complex instruction set, RISC emphasized simpler instructions, executed very fast, with lots of registers and aggressive pipelining. The theory was that, overall, a simpler design could go faster and scale better as fabrication improved. By the mid-80s, those ideas had escaped the lab. MIPS, born from Stanford work, turned into commercial processors. Sun Microsystems was developing SPARC, based on Berkeley RISC concepts. IBM was exploring its own RISC architectures internally. Workstation vendors especially were excited. RISC promised higher performance for scientific computing, graphics, and high-end Unix systems. For Motorola, this was a problem. The 6800 was beloved, but it was a complex CISC architecture. You could keep scaling it up, and Motorola did. But the buzz, and increasingly the benchmark wins, were shifting to RISC. Customers in the workstation and telecom world started asking uncomfortable questions. Did Motorola have a real RISC story? Would there be a path beyond 68K that could compete with MIPS, SPARC, and the new IBM designs? Inside Motorola, the pressure grew. If they stuck purely with CISC, they risked being seen as conservative, maybe even obsolete in the most demanding markets. If they embraced RISC, they risked undermining their own 68K franchise. The answer they settled on was ambitious and a little bit risky. Build a brand new, clean sheet RISC architecture alongside the 68K, targeted squarely at the high end. That new architecture would become the Motorola 8800 family. The heart of the 8800 story begins with the 88100, the first CPU in the line. It was announced in the late 1980s as a high-end RISC processor meant to compete head-on with contemporary MIPS and SPARC chips. Motorola approached it with a clear set of technical goals. They wanted a pure RISC architecture: fixed size instructions, a large register file, load store design, and a pipeline tuned for high clock speeds. The instruction set was intentionally clean and orthogonal, few special cases, a design that made it easier for compilers to generate efficient code. Architecturally, the 88100 followed a Harvard-style approach, separating instruction and data paths for performance. But one particularly interesting decision was to keep some responsibilities outside the main CPU. Instead of baking everything into a single monolithic chip, Motorola paired the 88100 with a separate companion chip, the 88200. The 88200 handled the on-chip cache and memory management unit, Your MMU. Systems could use multiple 88200s to scale cache sizes or system configurations. This modular approach was attractive for high-end system designers who wanted flexibility, though it also made boards more complex and expensive compared to single-chip competitors. The 88000's memory management and exception handling were often praised for being well thought out. It aimed to support sophisticated Unix-style operating systems with robust virtual memory, protection features, and a design that felt more like a carefully structured system than an evolved patchwork. As for who exactly designed it, the public record is a bit thin. Motorola didn't promote star chip architects the way some modern companies do. Instead, it drew on its experienced semiconductor design teams, people who had learned hard lessons from the 68000 and from building complex communication and embedded controllers. The culture favored solid engineering and long-term customers, like telecom and industrial clients, rather than flashy marketing. Among engineers who encountered it, the 88100 earned a reputation for elegance. It wasn't the fastest in every benchmark, and it certainly wasn't the cheapest, but its architecture felt internally consistent and forward-looking. This was a chip that wanted to scale, with multiple processors, with bigger caches, with more advanced implementations down the line. On paper, it looked like Motorola had a serious RISC contender. Now, they needed someone to actually build systems with it. The first wave of interest in the 88000 came from exactly the markets Motorola had in mind: workstations, servers, telecom, and high-end embedded systems. Companies like Data General, which had a long history in minicomputers, saw the 88K as a path into the new RISC workstation era. They launched the Avian line around the 88000, aiming at the same space as Sun's SPARC stations and MIPS-based systems from SGI and others. For a while, Avian machines gave the 88K visible presence in the Unix workstation world. Beyond Data General, various workstation and board vendors experimented with the 88000, often positioning it in technical computing, CAD, or networking. In telecom and networking, where Motorola already had strong relationships, the 88K was attractive as a high-performance CPU for switches, routers, and signaling equipment. The chip also found its way into some embedded and printer applications. Laser printers and other smart peripherals needed more muscle by the late 80s and early 90s, and a RISC processor with good memory handling and interrupt performance was appealing. Motorola, with its catalog of support chips and its reputation for long-term supply, was a familiar name to these OEMs. But hardware alone wasn't enough. RISC chips lived or died on their software ecosystem, particularly Unix. To build that ecosystem, Motorola and a number of partners created 88Open, a consortium focused on standardizing a Unix environment for the 88000. The goal was to avoid fragmentation, have a common ABI, consistent development tools, and a shared target that ISVs could support. 88Open hosted efforts around standardized Unix ports, compilers, and operating system support. It was an attempt to make the 88K feel like a safe bet. If you adopted it, you wouldn't be stuck in a tiny proprietary universe. For a moment it looked promising. The 88K was in real systems, backed by real companies, and it had an industry consortium behind its software story. But in the background, the competition was not standing still, and Motorola itself was about to change direction in a dramatic way. The turning point for the 88000 arrived in the early 1990s, when three companies, Apple, IBM, and Motorola, came together to form what became known as the AIM Alliance. Apple was looking for a way off the 68K and away from the looming performance dominance of Intel's x86. IBM had its own advanced RISC architecture, Power, deployed in high-end workstations and servers. Motorola had manufacturing expertise, the 68K line, and its new 88000 architecture, but not the same ecosystem momentum as x86 or the growing IBM RISC family. The AIM Alliance was meant to create a powerful third platform, a RISC architecture that could power future Macs, IBM systems, and a wide range of embedded devices. The result would be PowerPC, a streamlined descendant of IBM's Power architecture, adapted in part to suit Apple's needs and mass-market ambitions. For Motorola's executives, this was both an opportunity and a dilemma. On one hand, joining IBM and Apple opened doors, high-volume desktop systems, access to IBM's RISC IP, and a shared platform that might finally challenge Intel. On the other hand, Motorola already had its own RISC line, the 88,000. Continuing to invest heavily in both 88K and PowerPC would be expensive and confusing for customers. Internally, the logic that emerged was ruthless but understandable. IBM's power lineage already had serious design momentum and big iron credibility. Apple's volume would be tied to whatever chip family it chose for future Macs. The path of least resistance was to align Motorola's future 32-bit and 64-bit RISC work with PowerPC and gradually wind down the 88,000. There were also political and business considerations. Being a full partner in a widely promoted cross-company standard was more attractive than going it alone with a proprietary RISC line that hadn't yet broken through. The marketing story around PowerPC was far stronger than anything Motorola could muster by itself for the 88K. From the outside, details of the internal debates are not fully documented, but the outcome is clear. As PowerPC development accelerated, the 88,000 roadmap was de-emphasized. Resources, both engineering and marketing, shifted. New 88K designs still in the pipeline would emerge into a world where their own parent company was already talking more loudly about a different future. What had looked like a strong, if niche, contender in the RISC race was about to be quietly sidelined by its own maker. When a chip vendor quietly steps back from its own architecture, customers notice, sometimes immediately, sometimes in the worst possible way. For companies that had bet heavily on the 88,000, the PowerPC pivot felt like the ground moving under their feet. Data General's Avian line is one of the best-known examples. They had built an entire workstation and server family around the 88K, with software ported, customers installed, and a roadmap that assumed continued performance upgrades from Motorola. As Motorola's attention drifted toward PowerPC, it became clear that the 88,000 would not see the kind of sustained investment it would need to keep up with MIPS, Spark, and the new RISC kit on the block. PowerPC itself. For Avian and others, the only realistic option was to start planning a migration. Over time, Data General moved toward Intel-based systems, an expensive and complicated transition that undercut the original strategic bet on RISC. Other workstation and board vendors faced similar decisions. Some quietly dropped 88K-based products or shifted focus to architectures with stronger backing, MIPIs, Spark, PA RISC, or eventually standard x86. In telecom and networking, where product lifecycles were longer, some 88K-based designs lingered, but with the status of a legacy choice rather than a forward-looking one. The broader industry perception hardened quickly. The 88,000 was becoming an orphaned platform. Even as Motorola continued to sell parts and support existing customers, the message sent by its PowerPC enthusiasm was too loud to ignore. In a world where developers and system vendors had plenty of RISC options, no one wanted to be tied to the chip line that even its creator seemed eager to replace. The 88K didn't fail because it was technically unworkable. It failed because faith in its future evaporated. And once that kind of trust is gone in the processor business, it's very hard to recover. Despite its shrinking prospects, the 88,000 story didn't end overnight. Motorola still had silicon in the pipeline and customers depending on it. The most notable late entry in the family was the 88,110. A more integrated and advanced successor to the 88,100. Unlike the earlier split of CPU and cache/MMU across separate chips, the 88,110 pulled more functionality onto a single die and embraced superscalar execution, issuing multiple instructions per cycle, reflecting the wider industry trend toward more aggressive performance techniques. On paper, the 88,110 could have been the 88K family's real moment to shine. It addressed some of the cost and complexity issues of the earlier design, and it aimed squarely at the performance levels that high-end Unix vendors cared about. But by the time it arrived, the narrative was already shifting decisively toward PowerPC. For most potential new customers, the 88,110 looked less like a beginning and more like a last hurrah. Where the 88,000 did manage a quieter, longer life was in niches that valued stability and Motorola's long-term support reputation. Embedded systems, some automotive and industrial control, and telecom equipment. In these spaces, a design could remain in production for years or even decades, as long as the vendor kept making parts and the performance was adequate. Some later embedded processors from Motorola, and eventually its spun-off semiconductor arm, Freescale, reflected lessons learned from the 88K's memory system and cache/MMU design. Even as the mainline architectures moved toward PowerPC and then other embedded cores, the influence here is often indirect and sparsely documented, but engineers tend to carry techniques and preferences from one project to the next. In short, pieces of the 88,000's DNA likely survived longer than the branding did. But for the broader market, the family never recovered from being overshadowed by Motorola's own new flagship RISC line. By the late 1990s, the 88K was clearly part of computing's past, even as some of its chips quietly kept working in telecom racks and industrial boxes far from public view. Today, the Motorola 88,000 doesn't inspire the same nostalgia as the 68,000 or the long-running debates around x86 versus ARM. But among processor historians and retrocomputing enthusiasts, it holds a particular fascination. Part of that is the technical elegance. The 88K embodied a very clean take on RISC design from a major vendor that already knew how to ship complex processors at scale. Its split cache architecture with the 88,200, its well-structured memory management, and its scalability ambitions show a company thinking seriously about high-performance Unix systems, not just dabbling. Some of those ideas had echoes in later designs. The discipline around virtual memory, the attention to system-level integration, and even certain implementation techniques would live on in Motorola and Freescale's later embedded work, and in the broader ecosystem of RISC chips that shared many of the same design philosophies. But the bigger legacy of the 88,000 is a cautionary tale about how markets and corporate strategy can steamroll technology. Motorola invested serious engineering effort and customer goodwill into the 88K. Then, when the opportunity arose to join IBM and Apple in creating PowerPC, it effectively decided that even a good in-house RISC line was worth sacrificing for a chance at a larger platform play. From a boardroom perspective, the math might have made sense. From the perspective of 88K customers, it was painful. The 88,000's fate underlines a harsh reality. In processors, technical merit is just one factor. Ecosystems, alliances, software support, marketing, and long-term roadmaps matter just as much, sometimes more. A well-designed chip without a stable, believable future can lose to a less elegant architecture that has the backing of the right partners. Among enthusiasts who track these lost architectures, the 88K is remembered as one of the more tragic what-ifs. What if Motorola had doubled down on it instead of PowerPC? What if more workstation vendors had rallied around 88 Open? We can't know for sure, but given how crowded the RISC landscape was, and how fiercely Intel fought back, even a perfectly managed 88,000 story might still have ended in a niche. And that brings us back to the question we started with. How did a technically admired RISC chip become a historical footnote? Not because it was badly engineered, but because it lost the political and economic war for attention, partners, and time. In the end, the Motorola 88,000 reminds us that computer history isn't just written in silicon. It's written in boardrooms, standards committees, and customer roadmaps. The chips we remember aren't always the best. They're the ones that survived the complex game around them.